as told in Surviving Mold, I felt that starting a syndrome was more than sufficient to get my feet in the door. That anybody would want to hear what kind of evidence we had. And we have just passed 30 years without a single chronic fatigue syndrome researcher responding, not even to having read Mold Warriors and the story of mold at ground zero at chronic fatigue syndrome. So the medical system kind of failed us here. I was able to take advantage of this knowledge by avoiding mold pretty much from the start of the syndrome. At Truckee High School, a curious observation is they say that 9 out of the 10 teachers that used that teacher's lounge became ill. Now, why would they say 9 out of 10, as if there weren't other people that were in and out of that room? What prompted them to make an exception for this one sole person who didn't get sick? Well, they told you what it is. He felt that there was something in the room that was bothering him so much that he went out and sat in his car, he sat in his camper, and at times he would drive out to Donner Lake to get away from the school area in general because it just kind of felt bad around the whole place. So if chronic fatigue syndrome was a purely viral illness, then how do you account for the way it spread so swiftly and so completely through such a small group of teachers, and yet managed to spare this one teacher? Well, we could see during the progression of this outbreak that if you had this flu, if you got over it within about 4 weeks or so, actually within 2 weeks, you were completely out of the woods, you were fine. If you had it for about 4 weeks or so, you were in trouble. If it went on for 6 weeks or longer, then that was it. You were going to be one of Dr. Peterson's patients. There seemed to be some kind of immunological reprogramming that took place around the 4th week, where it switched from a purely toxic response mixed with a viral illness into some kind of autoimmune type activation. And that activation was perpetuated as long as you were in the slightest trace of these toxins, which still need some study. There's another Incline Village survivor, and we both stumbled over this at the same time, that as long as we stayed in town, downwind of that algal bloom, we couldn't really make much headway. I'll tell you how I found this guy. I was going out to the desert just because I felt so much better out there. If I could just get out there every weekend, I could recover to and build up some tolerance for going back into town. And I was out at a runway, at a dirt strip, and I saw this madman out in the hot desert sun, working up a sweat, raking the 700-foot runway with a hand rake. And I thought, this guy must be mad. I was so curious, I walked out to him and I asked, you know, well, there's a tractor over there with a rake. There's a, I'm sure they'll let you use it. It's kind of ridiculous that you should be doing this. And I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he pondered, okay, do I come up with some kind of lame excuse, or do I just go ahead and spit it out? Well, fortunately, he was an honest guy, and he said, well, you see, I have this chronic fatigue syndrome, and I come out here and I do this because it's the only thing that helps. My first thought was I was flabbergasted. If he had chronic fatigue syndrome, how could he possibly be standing up or walking? We were crawling, as you saw in the video. We were paralyzed. We were sick. It was everything we could do to take care of our daily needs. And of course, he was doing the same thing I was. So thinking that chronic fatigue syndrome was what researchers would be eager to hear about this, I started approaching them. And as we saw with Mary Ackley's presentation on paradigm shift, the resistance is absolutely phenomenal. Every excuse, every obfuscation, every act of prevarication that people can indulge in to try to avoid looking at the documented evidence that we can present directly out of this inception of the syndrome was brought to bear. And unfortunately for everybody else, the information about the action of these biotoxins and what mold avoidance was doing for some of us was suppressed. And I suppose I should have let it go, but somehow I thought that just wasn't right. You know, there's just too many sick people out there, and people looking for answers. I started taking people on what I call the chronic fatigue syndrome history mold tour. Any patient willing enough or crazy enough to go with me, I'd take them to the exact spots, the places where the clusters of mystery illness occurred, and some of them are still pretty bad. And as we get close, I try to approach from upwind, and I try to be careful. Sometimes I make a mistake, you know, people have gotten pretty badly hit. But when I see the veins starting to stand out, and I see them turn pale and start to stagger around a little bit, I go, that's far enough. Now you know, this is it, this is the spot. These people have joined my little band of moldies and helped spread the word. And I was hoping there was going to be a graphic for it here, but the website that we've got is Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Untied, CFS Untied, Unraveling the Mystery of Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, where we explain how I came up with the nanoparticle theory and a bit more of what I've done with the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome mold tour. And this is 2009, the IACFSME conference in Reno, where Dr. Shoemaker did a brilliant presentation on the biomarkers for the chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And all the major researchers saw it and congratulated, and they were very nice, and then proceeded to ignore it for the next 6 years. But we've got the evidence. We can prove our case. We've got a copy of Mold Warriors that's been carried up to the top of Mount Whitney by a prototype for chronic fatigue syndrome. And I believe that we're eventually getting close. We should be able to get some attention from them in the near future. Not too long ago,